Hey everyone, how is it going? Luke here. Today we're gonna jump into my first YouTube video in which we are going to specifically focus on 3 of the most common pre-flop mistakes I see low stakes players making all the time. Some of these mistakes I've been making myself as well in the past, and if you are watching this video right now, it is very likely you're making these mistakes right now as well. Let's jump right into the action. Today we're gonna focus specifically on 3-betting pre-flop. Some of the biggest mistakes people make when it comes to 3-betting pre-flop is that they are 3-betting single-suited rundowns too often, they are 3-betting too many double-suited trash hands, as well as that they are 3-betting too many high pairs. Now let's jump into each one of these individually to understand better what we're talking about. Let's kick it off by looking into the single-suited rundowns. Single-suited rundowns aren't generally a great candidate to 3-bet with. These hands, they don't hold an equity advantage against almost any range, and they also have a very high risk of being dominated, both in a 3-bet pot as well as in a potentially 4-bet pot. Now let's look at 2 hand examples to illustrate this a little bit better. Here we are sitting on King, King, Queen 10 double suited in early position. I open raise and the MP player is sitting on 8, 7, 6, 5 single suited, and he decides to 3-bet me. Now why is this hand not a great candidate to choose from when it comes to 3-betting here? First of all, this hand is obviously not pushing an equity advantage against my range. And secondly, and maybe more importantly, is that this hand will be dominated in 3-bet pots as well as in potentially 4-bet pots very often by better suits and also by higher rundowns. If you think about this specific hand on a lot of flops, very often there will be a lot of overcards to the board, your hand will flop bottom pair or middle pair, your suits will be very marginal and low, here for example 7 high with spades, or a straight draw that you will flop is often at the bottom end of the flop. And this isn't specifically great because that allows you to not stack off on a majority of flops here. And that is not what you want in 3-bet pots. You want to be able to stack off on as many flops as possible. And to do that, you want to have generally high suits and strong hands to start off with. This player though, however, he decides to 3-bet me. The cutoff folds as well as the button. The small blind in this situation decides to cold call. Something that happens very often in these low stakes environments. We're not going to focus on that, but this shouldn't be a hand he decides to cold call there with. Anyway, he does cold call. The big blind also comes into the mix and we decide to 4-bet here. We have a very strong hand at this point. There's a lot of dead money in the middle. Obviously the MP player can have aces, which wouldn't be great for our hand, but he will also have still quite a lot of other hands. For example, here you can see what he can show up with. Maybe I had a read at this specific point. I can't recall it right now. But anyway, I made the 4-bet. The MP player gets the money in, as well as the small blind. Big blind folds, and we get the money into the middle here. After the run out, we make a nice win here by taking down the pot. And this illustrates quite nicely how domination can play a huge role here. Let's jump into another hand example. Here we are sitting on ace, ace, queen 4 in the MP position. We open raise again. Cutoff decides to call here. And the button this time, he decides to make a squeeze with queen jack 9, 7 single suited. Now this hand is way too much out of line to choose from when it comes to squeezing or 3-betting in the first place. The hand is too disconnected, too marginal. You don't block 4-betting ranges. Your suits can be dominated quite often. And the hand just generally doesn't perform great in this scenario. It's a hand you want to fold, you not even want to call here, just muck it and move on to the next hand. Anyway, this player decides to make the squeeze here, the blinds fold, we have an easy 4-bet, cutoff folds. The button, obviously he cannot fold now anymore, he invested too much money, so he decides to call. This is the flop, easy play for me, as well as for the button, the money goes in, and we take down a nice pot here. Let's move on to the next situation that we're going to talk about today, which is 3-betting double-suited trash hands. Double-suited trash hands are one of the hands that are mostly overvalued by many players, including myself in the past. These hands often look so pretty in a way and so playable, but many of them simply aren't. These hands are often heavily risked to being dominated by higher suits because a lot of these disconnected double suited rundowns, they come with low suits as well, which will be dominated very often. And secondly, maybe more importantly, and something that many players will not see too easily here with these hands, is that they are actually very disconnected. And even though our hand is double suited, we don't want to be playing the most disconnected combinations. For example here, King Jack 8-5, it's not a hand to pick from, it's simply too weak. And we miss out as this hand looks so nice, as I like to call it. Let's jump into a few hand examples here as well to illustrate this again a little bit better. Here we are sitting on ace 8 7 5 double suited in MP. We decide to open raise obviously, and the cutoff this time decides to 3-bet me with Queen Jack 8-8 double suited. Now this hand has a few problems. First of all, it doesn't block 4-betting ranges. And because my range in MP is fairly tight and well defined, he has quite a high risk to face a 4-bet here because he doesn't block that ace and even the king there. And that plays a huge role here. And the risk of being 4-bet will go up quite a bit here. And secondly, this hand also is quite disconnected. If you would ever choose to 3-bet some of these type of hands, we want to play stronger hands, hands with better connectivity, and hands that just generally perform better in 3-bet pots. Anyway, this player decides to make the 3-bet, which is an incorrect play. The blinds and the button all fold. We decide to use this hand as one of our 4-bet bluffing candidates. It's not a topic of today, maybe for a later video, but this is a decent candidate to do it with because we also block the ace there and we have a flop distribution that is very smooth. We will very often flop a piece of the board here. We raise. The cutoff here is now calling. He doesn't want to fold anymore, being double suited obviously. And the money on the flop goes in as we both flop somewhat the top of our range with this specific hand. We both flop very strong at this flop. We have top pair, we have the nut flush draw, we have a gut shot to the straight, and our opponent has an overpair and as well as the flush draw. So both players cannot flop much better. And even here you can see that my hand here is having almost 70% equity in this specific situation, which is obviously a lot. Anyway, the money goes in and we would take down a nice pot here. Let's move into one other hand example here. We're sitting at ace 6-4, single suited. We decide to open raise, button 3-bets us with Jack 7-5-4. This is a classic example of a way to disconnect a double suited hand. You don't want to use it as a 3-bet. The hand doesn't perform great in 3-bet and in 4-bet pots. You don't flop as smooth. Again, you will often flop bottom or middle pair with like a 7 high flush draw, for example. And that just isn't that great in general because you're going to lose quite often the pot on the flop by being dominated, for example. Anyway, he decides to make the 3-bet. Again, it's not a great move. It's incorrect. This is just a hand you want to muck here in general because it doesn't perform as well. We have an easy 4-bet. He calls, obviously. And on the flop, the money goes in as both players can stack off on this flop at SPR around 1. We take down a nice pot and we move on to the last situation of today, which will be 3-betting high pairs. And this is maybe one of the most important categories of hands. Many players overvalue and over 3-bet with high pairs. Especially hands like this, for example, King 5-4. There are situations, obviously, where 3-betting them is totally fine. But in general, you want to be very careful with kings, queens, jacks, especially if you don't block that ace in addition to it. Because not having an ace in your hand doesn't block 4-betting range, and therefore the chance of being 4-bet is very high here. These hands aren't great to choose as a 3-bet from because they can't call a 4-bet against the ace heavy range. They do very poor and they have to fold most of the time facing a 4-bet. And as mentioned before, we don't block the aces here. Now let's look into two hand examples here as well to illustrate this final topic a little bit better. Here we're sitting on ace 3-4, single suited in the MP position. We open raise and the button here decides to 3-bet queen 10-8. He's a bit shorter, but still this hand shouldn't be played as a 3-bet. It does very poor against 4-bet ranges. It doesn't block 4-bet ranges by not having an ace. It can still call play position, have decent playability post-flop, but for 3-bet pots, the hand is too marginal. There are 2 gaps in there, we only have 1 suit, and there are just too many reasons not wanting to 3-bet this specific hand. Even at 100 big blinds here, you shouldn't 3-bet a hand like this. Again, think also about open raising ranges. He's sitting on the button facing an MP open raising range. A fairly tight and well-defined range, often consists of aces and kings. He doesn't block them. So in general, he's not doing that great here. Anyway, he decides to 3-bet me. We have an easy 4-bet again. The money goes in and we take down a pot here. The final hand of today, before we're going to wrap up this first episode, we're sitting in the cutoff here, 10-10-9-7, double suited, fairly standard open. And the button now is sitting on king, queen, queen, jack, single suited. He decides to 3-bet me. Now this is an interesting candidate because many of us would overvalue this hand quite a bit. It definitely looks very strong and it is a strong hand. But think about what happens if you, for example, get 4-bet here. That is not a great outcome, first of all, because we're being dominated super heavily there. And secondly, this hand also plays perfectly fine as a call. We can get in the blinds that can call with weaker pairs and lower suits that we can dominate. We have position versus the cutoff throughout the entire hand. And overall, this hand just isn't a great candidate to choose from as a 3-bet here. Many of these kings and queens that have decent connectivity like this, some of them are being utilized as a 3-bet. Totally makes sense, especially if, for example, the cutoff is somewhat wider. But in general, you want to pay very close attention to the situation, your opponent's open raising range, and you don't want to overvalue these type of hands and 3-bet them regardlessly. Anyway, he does 3-bet. We call. The flop comes down 10-8-3 rainbow. We check, obviously, having top set and an open-ended straight draw, heavily blocking the board. Our opponent checks back. On the 3, I decided to check again, going for a check raise here, maybe a check call. But I expect him to now start barreling quite a bit with his aces and kings heavy range. The 3 is obviously a good card for his range and not specifically a good card for mine. Anyway, he decides to check back. On the ace, I decided to check again because that hand is so strongly within our opponent's 3-betting range. He decides to check back and we take down the pot here. Now I hope all these elements about 3-betting today, the mistakes that I showed, gave you some more information about why you shouldn't overvalue most of these hands. As mentioned, there are circumstances where 3-betting some of these are totally fine, but in general, we're 3-betting way too often with these combinations, and you want to be careful there and not overvaluing them regardlessly of the situation. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like the video if you do, and I will see you otherwise in the next video. Over and out. My name is Luke.